Yeah, you were saying, Matt, well, I'm interested in sleep, definitely. So tell me.
Yeah, no, it's just one of the areas that I'd never really focused in on was like sleep. And it's so essential because all the
Mm,
stuff online, especially for men, it's like working out, diet, all that sort of stuff, spiritual health. But I'd never looked into my sleep
mm,
in a big way. But this guy
mm,
was really helpful, and just like some of the basic things, because of course I speak a lot about addictions and compulsions, and I've had major struggles with those in my life, and coming to terms with those has been the most life-changing thing. When you start dealing with these addictions and understand what you're hiding underneath, and
mm,
you go through that healing process, it's so deeply, deeply rewarding, so meaningful. But I realized I'm probably actually addicted to my smartphone without even knowing
mm,
it. I'm
mm,
always checking it all day. I'm speaking with clients, I'm checking things, I'm watching YouTube videos, etc.,
mm,
etc. And even before bed, I'd be like watching some video, some random conversation. And then I started reading, well, through this guy, I started learning about blue light on phones.
oh,
Apparently, it's
yeah.
really bad for like testosterone, it impacts your sleep. So, the
Mm,
first thing I did was get rid of the phone, which I thought would be hard, but was easy as anything, man. Easy as pie.
mm,
I was like, I left it outside for an hour before I went to bed. And the first night was a bit like, yeah, normally I'd check my phone now, watch a football, whatever else it would be. But it was
mm,
easy. It really was easy. I mean, if I was a bit bored or I wasn't ready to sleep, I'd just read. And in the
mm,
morning, instead of reaching for my phone, I mean, normally I'd always wake up with a little prayer or a bit of meditation, but
mm,
then I'd go for my phone, but I was just leaving it that bit longer.
mm,
And because it's outside the room, again, I'd either just sit in meditation for a bit longer or read. And that alone made a massive, massive difference.
mm,
And then all the other
mm,
little bits, like, cutting out caffeine and all that sort of stuff was, well, not cutting out caffeine completely, but nothing after 4 p.m. I drink
mm,
tea, not really coffee,
mm.
but just tea, which is quite minor in its caffeine content. But even that, having it after 4 p.m.
I
was
know.
keeping it up a bit.
That's interesting. It kind of like, yeah, definitely feeds into like what was going to be my last question, but something that I think about like constantly. Like, let me try and be, I don't know. Let me just try and be like clear with it. Like, for instance, I've gone really heavy on this tree theme, as you can see. I've got
Yeah.
trees in the background, trees on here, and then I'm wearing this. I guess like what you're saying about like the phone. We talk about social media, like overuse of social media, and I'm with you on all of these things. But what it seems, and someone was on Stephen Bartlett's podcast talking about sleep and kind of like having more breaks away from like just content in general. But what the overarching picture I've got is like modern life is like super unhealthy, kind of in mentally, yeah, kind of unhealthy. And we have to put all these things in place, like all this discipline and all this kind of all this discipline and education to kind of just push away what push away all this technology and this stuff that's kind of unnatural, and kind of the conclusion from all the sleep experts and the psychologists and everyone is like it's not it's unhealthy, and it's kind of going to degrade your. I read another thing about the fact that like absolutely everyone's being diagnosed with adult ADHD,
Yeah.
which I can relate to, but this article was kind of poking fun at it, and the article was saying, well, it's modern life, like it's smartphones, it's advertising. The reason it's shining a light on this is because all of this, I was saying to my friend, like most people's jobs involve dealing with 20, 30 emails a day kind of thing. That's just whatever you're doing. That's just like a normal, that's just like, that's how we operate. Most people that are doing like desk jobs, and desk jobs by their nature are kind of unhealthy because of posture and what you're doing with your body. So all of that kind of, we're talking, have these conversations over and over again, but all of it points to me is it's like you're living, I don't want to be over dramatic, but if you're living in a kind of toxic environment, that the whole thing's not set up for you to win. Do you know what I mean? And it takes a huge amount of willpower just to kind of detoxify your environment. That's all we're talking about, just being a bit healthier. The fact that we have to have a conversation about sleep, like I see these things over and over. I read, I kind of hear scientists talk and I read things, but intuitively we know when we feel better if we can just get to bed at a decent time and not have electronic devices. Like we kind of know that naturally anyway. I guess it's just like the last decade we've been bombarded with this stuff that wasn't there before, and we forgot. Do you know what I mean? But if my granddad heard, like, I just think it was easier to be healthy in previous generations potentially.
Yeah, look, I hear what you're saying, man. I mean, I personally think that if we are to develop, if you like, as a society, as a civilization, as a culture, there will be a return, a correction back to more of a natural way of living. Because
Mm,
if you think about rhythms, like the rhythm of the moon going up, the rhythm of the sun going down, life is rhythm ultimately. But
mm,
modern life, if you like, it tries to buck that rhythm. And that tends to be when people get unhealthy, is when
mm,
we really get out of that natural rhythm of some sort. And
mm,
henceforth, I think there will have to be a massive push back to that. Again, I think some people, unfortunately, are just blind to it, and you're almost plugged into the matrix. I know I
mm,
was for a bit, but I mean, I had a friend of mine who is like he's like a head of year at a school in the north, and we were talking about an issue similar to this, and he was saying like, there's a bit of a push in school to get kids out into nature, but it's kind of not really working because you take these kids out for half an hour in a walk in a park or through the woods, and they're not just going to magically like kick into gear into a different rhythm. They've been so pumped full of TikTok videos and YouTube, and
mm,
as many of us have, not just kids, but all of that pace of that culture is
mm,
what their rhythm is. They're trapped in that attention economy. I mean, I
mm,
think I read somewhere that in the modern era, um, people's attention span is about 8 seconds,
mm,
So that's how quick, it is before someone loses their attention. And of course, a lot of it just feeds us into the deep, deep sense of dysfunction and irrhythm, if you like. And
mm,
again, I think that there is a yearning for that return to something a bit more earthy. I
mm,
went to see this guy as well recently called Rupert Sheldrake. He's quite an interesting guy.
mhm,
He's like he came from a biology background, but then he started to move more into spirituality, if you like. And he has these really interesting notions around like the it's not quite the rhythms, but if you like, it's the underlying structures that inform our world. And he was saying all this stuff about how he avoids like excessive Bluetooth, excessive Wi-Fi. And he said,
mm,
I know you can't avoid it totally, but we need to get back away from all of that and into, if you like, the natural rhythms of life. And I think that's so true.
mm,
I understand it's almost impossible in many ways in the modern world, but you have to maximize what you can and where you can.
mm. I agree. I agree. I think my I'd really like to have these kind of chats face to. I went to a country park with my girlfriend, and there were like it was in a forest in Surrey somewhere, and there were like these huge wigwams in the forest, which is just lovely and restorative anyway. But inside these wigwams, it was really nice, and I'm quite interested in like Native American culture and just
Mm,
indigenous cultures because it's like an example of like another way of life that people that we've kind of forgotten.
mm.
Yeah, that we've forgotten, and we definitely don't have much access to. But yeah, I'd really ideally have these talks like face to face around a campfire, or have some kind of physical space to have these chats, which is why I've called this thing Temple. But I don't see how. I don't know. I, there's that tension because I don't see how I could ever make a living out of doing, how I could not commercialize it, but I've still got this capitalist kind of like mindset over everything, which is like, how would I, how am I going to make this kind of work for me, like, in the modern world kind of thing. But that's by the by anyway. I should ask you, I'll go back to the start and ask, and I'll go
Yeah,
back to
man.
the
Yeah,
start
yeah.
and interview you and stop rambling. But how long, first question, like how long kind of have you got? Like,
I'm pretty good till about 5. Maybe I
yeah,
can push on a little bit. I've got a call at 6. So I like to get something to eat and do a bit of prep before
yeah,
that. So 5 half
exactly.
5.
If that's the case, then great. They'll jump into it and try and bring some structure to give you the most value and yeah, because I could probably go on till the evening, but we'll try and we can always talk again.
Yeah,
So
man.
thanks for joining me. I tested this format with my sister, we had a great chat about. She went to Portugal and did an ayahuasca retreat couple of weeks ago. So that was good. And I just want to talk to interesting people in this naturalistic, as much as we're not in a real forest, but bring people to somewhere that I enjoy being. Probably my rhythm ideally will be every Friday I'll get talk to someone,
Mm,
and I'll edit some clips from it, and I'll start putting them all onto YouTube ideally. But yeah, I mean, I followed you. We spoke before. I've followed you on Instagram. I find what you post for the last 2 years, I think, really. You're doing a lot of reading, as you've said. I can tell you're doing a lot of reading, listening to a lot of sages and a lot of interesting people. And I think from what I've read of your content, obviously everyone on the internet, I don't agree with everything that everybody says, but I do think I've really been touched by a lot of things that you've said and found it really relatable, really sensible, and just stuff that's kind of resonated with me, really. So yeah, I wanted to get and talk about your work and talk more about yourself. I know we had an initial chat, but just for anybody that doesn't know you, my first question was just tell me about yourself, potentially your childhood, if you and your youth. Where did you grow up? Because I didn't know. I don't know that actually, and I just detect a bit of an accent, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, yeah, no, my accent's a bit all over the place when it comes to England, really, because I grew up in Leicester, which is in the Midlands.
Mm,
Henceforth, I'll say grass and past and glass, but
that.
everything else about me sounds a bit southern. So I'm kind of a southerner in the Midlands and a Midlander in the south. But I have a bit of a blended accent there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I grew up in Leicester, and to be honest, it was very, very much an average upbringing for the first sort of 10 years of my life. Um, I suppose that there wasn't really anything that notable for the
Yeah.
first like 10, 11 years. I mean, I was always a bit of a sensitive kid. I think that's almost important to mention because I think that meant that I was always sensitive to my surroundings. Always had
Mm,
that third eye on, if you like, which can be a blessing and a curse. And if
mm,
things go bad in your life, a really big curse. But if you
mm,
learn how to deal with it, which I think I have over time, it can be a pretty big blessing. But then my parents got divorced in 1997. I often mention the year because it was the year of New Labour coming into power. And in fact, there was a big ethos change there as well with regards to the country. And it was almost like my mother had that ethos and my father had more of a traditional ethos. But
mm,
anyway, my parents broke up, and it was like a new way of life, I suppose, that we entered into. And this is where a lot of the work that I now do becomes quite relevant because I didn't know any of this back then, of course, but at that point, my elder brother sort of became the man of the house without really knowing he was or wanting to. And I think in a way he couldn't deal with that. But his immediate response to that was ultimately to go and embrace quote unquote freedom, what is probably more accurately licentiousness, going out
mm,
doing whatever the hell he wants to do. And he got mixed up in drugs and all sorts of stuff. And he was always a very popular kid at school, but he really lost himself. He's taking
mm,
drugs way beyond his station when he's very, very young. He had a very sensitive mind and he was acutely aware, if you like, of social trends, which again, I think you need to be careful when you have that nature. You need to nurture it. You don't want to bombard it with drugs when you're very young, which ultimately what he did. And he sort of
mm,
lost himself in it and never really came back. And then
mm,
that henceforth meant for me that my life was quite frightening as a teenager. My older brother was getting more and more lost into the world of drugs and losing his mind in the process, and
gosh.
getting more and more violent and aggressive. And ultimately, that led me to a place where I often speak about the guys I'm doing the work with. The first thing I do when I do some work with a guy is trying to understand his underlying narratives that have gone on in his life, which tells him about who he is.
Mm,
One of mine, which developed to this point in my life, was everything's going to end badly. That's what I told myself about life because every time I come home, I'd be so frightened of my brother and how he's going to react.
mm,
I won't go into detail with some of the stuff, but it was pretty edgy, pretty spicy stuff. We're talking riot vans would be called. It was bad.
gosh.
And I henceforth was like, look, I can't deal with this. I might get physically attacked, but I can't deal with this constant emotional threat,
Mm,
of violence. So my defense mechanism was, well, just imagine this will end in violence. So henceforth, if this physical eruption happens, well, so be it. But at least I'm prepared, you know. So, but henceforth, if you live with that mentality, you kind of have that poise of being constantly in a siege mentality,
mm,
and that's what I developed. Now, in time, we all got a bit older, and my brother eventually moved on. He had his own difficulties and was in care for a lot of the time, and in
mm,
and out, and in and out of jails as well. But
gosh.
I then got into cannabis, started smoking cannabis in a big way. And I'm not trying to make a point here about cannabis. I know some people are very pro and some people are very anti. not trying to make a point on that. It's just for me at that time, it was not the right decision, especially as a very young guy. So obviously lots
Mm.
of research out now about how young fellas smoking cannabis, it can really damage them.
Yeah,
And
I've got to admit, I abused cannabis. I think we're probably of a similar generation, and yeah,
yeah,
my
yeah,
me and my friends abused cannabis as well.
yeah.
Yeah, that's part of my background
No,
as well.
I hear
But
you,
go on.
man.
Mm,
Yeah, I hear you, man. And again, like you do find this story like through every walk of life I've been in, you
mm,
find someone who's like, oh, such and such's nephew or my friend or my uncle or whatever it is, and they'll say like he just smoked loads of weed and just got a bit nutty. It's
mm.
very, very common story. It's tragic as well. And again, I'm not trying to badmouth weed. I know I've got friends who smoke weed and they say it enhances their creative process. So I get that.
That's
And I
why I
used
now say abuse as
yeah,
rather.
yeah,
I think it would
exactly,
have
man.
been. I think it would have been. I think moderation, like many things, and maybe like when you're a bit older, like you
Yeah,
can
yeah,
probably. But I've
yeah.
read, looked at some of the stuff as well, and abusing cannabis like daily, time when your brain is still really making connections and things like that. Yeah,
Yeah,
I've
exactly. And
been
then
there.
you're also traumatized as well. That's another
Mm,
key issue for me. Like I was deeply traumatized. I was deeply frightened. I didn't have, and of course, this is the work I do now. I didn't have any of that masculine structure to give me a sense of confidence and competence in the world. I didn't have any.
Richard,
Go on, man.
can I just stop you because this is distracting me. Do you mind?
No
Can I just
worries, man. No worries. Yeah, do what you
I'll
got to
stop
do.
you and then I'll just clip this bit, but it's distracting me.
No
And,
worries, man.
and this is really good conversation. So I don't know. I think it's because of what I'm wearing. The screen is confused. Oh no! Oh, that's better. That's
Yeah, yeah. I think you got it there, man.
that's better. So
Cool.
yeah, so you started smoking cannabis.
Yeah, yeah. And I was smoking cannabis again, I was deeply, deeply lost, and henceforth, it really it sort of made things a lot worse. I didn't really realize what it was doing at first, but ultimately, it's not a good way to deal with it when you're very young.
Mm,
And like we are just saying, I think I didn't have that fatherly figure in terms of my actual father. He was in London at that point. I was in Leicester. My elder brother, he had kind of lost himself in that world of drugs. He's taking things much harder than cannabis as well at that point.
mm,
And again, I kind of just was looking for that guidance, but not finding it anywhere. So I felt deeply, deeply imbalanced. And that led me to getting it like huge panic attacks. But when I look back, it was probably more of a nervous breakdown, really. I think I was just hammered by every angle. I kind of lost my family. I was very, very pained and ultimately confused about what life was or where I was going. At this point, I was about 17 and
right.
didn't know what to do. So, yeah, at that point, I had a girlfriend and I became very, very clingy towards her. She was almost like all I had. And I also would look up to all kinds of random different men, really, or young men who were in my life at that point to try and be that father figure. But
Mm,
again, that's a very risky thing to do because a lot of those people just manipulated me. They saw my neediness in that sense and my sort of desire for that social credibility, that desire to be someone. But very often it was the wrong sort of groups I was looking to,
mm,
and people who didn't have the ability to manage that need in a young male. They didn't know what they were doing, and they had
mm,
their own issues too. So all of their
mm,
poison fell out into me as well. And that eventually, well, so as an extra dimension is the woman I was with. She started to grow apart from me a little bit. I was too clingy, and then it led to a situation where she essentially, found her own way in life, and she really broke my heart. Basically, she left, and I think she went off with one of my friends one evening, which I never really knew, but I think it was one of these things. It was like a house party late at night, or someone walking off together, and it broke me, man. It broke me because it was like at this point, like my mind was going because of the weed. My brother had gone, my dad had gone, and this girl was like the only person I kind of really
mm.
trusted. She'd gone as well, and I remember it was all like high and drunk at that point, and it was a horrible experience.
Yeah.
And again, it put me into that place where I was like, I don't trust intimacy at all. I really don't. I don't trust men. I don't trust women. So I kind of became very insular, and I honestly thought like, well, I was kind of pseudo suicidal in a way back then. I didn't know what I was going to do in my life, and I went off to uni, and I basically had a lifestyle where pornography became my sexual outlet, and philosophy became, I guess, the meaning that I had in life because I was just desperately searching for
Mm,
meaning. the only place I knew where to look or knew what to do was just to think. So it's such a toxic mix, man. I mean, just like in my head all day, reading all this philosophy, and then no actual real interactions with people at uni, which is supposed to be the best time of your life. But I was so insular. I was quite an odd guy back then as well because I was so tangled up.
Mm,
I think a lot of the people I was at uni with didn't get me either. You know, they really couldn't reach me. And they were like average guys. You know, they weren't bad people. They were just average guys having a uni experience. But I was kind of the weirdo who would be upstairs reading philosophy and listening to all kind of obscure music, but wouldn't really know how to speak to people. You know, I couldn't really connect. I
mm.
could speak either about the weather or like the deepest existential angst you can imagine.
Yeah, yeah, no, I know that. Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine. I can, yeah, we would, you know, this particular friend of mine was really deep into philosophy at really young, like, and I've always been myself drawn to reading and philosophy. This guy discovered Eckhart Tolle when we were, again, smoking loads of weed, about 15, 16. And just, yeah, read and read. And it was like, that's a, wormhole into rabbit hole into that whole world, and we were talking about that, and it can be difficult, as you said, to then go and relate to the normal,
Yeah,
normal, the
I
outside world,
guess.
and people that are not, that are kind of, yeah, that not, that haven't read what you've read or are not thinking
Well,
about
I
that.
suppose so, but like I think for me, like it wasn't things like Eckhart Tolle I was reading. I class him someone more in the spiritual realm. It was like
Ooh,
hardcore philosophy, like
ooh,
it was mind-based
I-
stuff. So it was all like
yeah,
thinking. And I probably what I
deconstructing everything.
needed. Yeah,
Mm,
exactly. I was trying to work everything out. And of course, as famously as you learn in philosophy, is there are no answers, just the right questions. And that was basically what I had to figure out over like 3 or 4 years. And it
mm.
just made me more insular, more lost. And I was also into like existentialism, which is kind of like, what's the point in life? There is no meaning to life. Life is basically
Yeah,
suffering.
I don't see Nietzsche as a. I know you like Nietzsche actually. When I don't read, I don't know much about him or of him. I just hear like I hear quotes and things like that, and I just don't imagine him being a happy person. So I just stay clear of it. I'm like, my image of him is not a, you know, it's dark, you know. So I'm like, I don't, I get a taste of what he's about, and it doesn't sound very healthy or something that I want to delve into. That do you know what I mean? I could be wrong, but it's like a music. I've heard a little bit of it, and I'm like, no, not for me. That's how I see Nietzsche and existentialism. My sister read a book about existentialism and came away going, "Oh, I've just realised everything's pointless." And I'm like, well, see, that's not going to serve you very well, yeah, for the next month or whatever. But that's how I felt anyway.
No, right on, man. I mean, like again, I'll personally say now that I'm very wary of Nietzsche too. He is fascinating to read, but ultimately, it's like he did go mad himself, and that you will go mad with that level of philosophical intensity. But
Mm,
the other thing about all of that as well is that yeah, it's without God, it's without the divine, and that's ultimately where I had to get to. Now, what that
yes,
ultimately means to me, I will explain later. It's maybe
great.
not what it's often traditionally laid out as, or at least it wasn't in my experience.
Mm,
But again, that's ultimately what I found. It's all human. In fact, he has this book called Human, All Too Human. But anyway, I was deeply lost in that and
mm-hmm.
deeply insular, and very much just a broken guy, drinking very heavily. And I got through university, and then after that, I didn't really know what I was doing with life. But my brother at that point died; he took his own life. So after
Gosh,
that, I was like, I really need to get myself in order. You know, this is dangerous. This is edgy. This stuff,
gosh.
and I did my absolute best to get myself in order. You know, I tried to read books, self help, all that sort of stuff. Started running. Now these were really positive things, but I was trying to solve the inside via means from the outside. So basically, long story short, I was still repeating the same negative patterns. I might have improved my ability to speak to women and etc., but I was still needy because I was still heartbroken. I was still lost. I was still damaged. And
Mm,
as that went on, you know, I had a series of broken relationships as I tried to get more involved with women, but could never hack it. Could never make sense of it. And then ended up getting a job down in London, and quite a good job, you know, but it was in media world. But at the same time, it was rooted on this external stuff I'd learned, all the self-help stuff, which is good again for your external, but it wasn't doing it for the internal. So before I knew it, I was about 27. I had a good job. I was an editor of a business magazine. I was going out with a nice girl, pretty girl down in London, although maybe she had some toxic behaviors that I couldn't see back then. And I had a flat in London. So it was like, well, look, this is, well, renting a flat in London. So it was like, well, look, this is going well on the surface. But what happened with me was I was still completely lost in this woman. You know, I was too needy, and that exploded our relationship. It meant that she would go off and I would then go and sort of in a very broken way, go and try and hook up with other chicks and all that sort of thing and practice pickup to try and make her jealous. But ultimately, you know, I still was just pining after her. And the job I was in was really quite abusive. It was a completely toxic workplace. Lots of drugs were there, lots of
Mm,
toxic behavior. And again, I was just basically in a pressure cooker, being really lost in this woman, in this toxic job. And all this stuff from the past that I hadn't dealt with was just bubbling away inside of me. And one day it just went bang. You know, it's about 3 years this went on of this lifestyle of chasing this girl I was codependent with, drinking all the time, very often all weekend, from
mm,
Friday night, all Saturday, all Sunday, and then go to work on Monday and just have the worst. They weren't even hangovers, they were like withdrawals, you know, just
mm,
horrible. And yeah, this went on for like 3 years and it all just exploded in my face one day. And I'll cut long story short, but I ended up in a rehab. And at that moment, that's when, if you like, I had my sort of breakthrough experience. You know, everything
mm,
in my life had crumbled. I'd lost the woman I was completely mad about. I'd lost my job. I'd lost my mind. But what was so bizarre about it is I'd lost all of my external identity, and all that was left was this raw pain for me just to feel. But as I felt that raw pain came this deep, deep sense of freedom. And I think it was very important to add that I was suicidal at the time. And when I hear men today say they're suicidal, I honestly believe they don't want to kill themselves. If you speak to them, I don't think they do. What they want is their present state of being to end, which is a different thing to wanting to kill yourself. You
mm,
know, they want to live, but they can't bear the way they're living and the psychological state they're in. And I get
mhm,
that. I
mhm,
personally see that as the birth pangs of a new generation, as the Bible calls it. And it's
mm,
they're dying for a spiritual awakening. They're dying to find themselves as who they
mm,
really are.
mm,
And by hook or by crook or by luck or whatever else, that was the experience I had where I realized, shit, man, I know nothing about life. What am I doing thinking I can work all this out? And this was all, it all happened before my mind. And I realized there was a very deep sense of peace, very small, but very deep sense of peace inside me there. And I had this intuitive knowledge to protect that. And henceforth, I came out of the rehab and I was very dedicated to meet the right people, got involved in a lot of men's work, recovery work, spiritual guides, everything you can possibly imagine.
mm,
And I shouldn't say they put me back together, but they allowed the truth of me to come out. You know, I had to bare
mm,
my soul with other men, deal with all of that trauma, express it to another man, the divine, and myself, work through trusting men again. I mean, doing a lot of men's work and work that was of an intimate nature with men was very powerful for me because
mm,
my understanding of men was they are violent and they're dangerous and they will kill you. You know, that was my understanding of it because my early life, that was my messaging. So
mm,
I met this really, really great guy who I did a lot of work with. And he wasn't emotional in the slightest, but he was very sincere in what he did. And I remember I was doing a bit of therapy and all that sort of stuff. And I had a bit of a problem with going there and pouring my heart out and wanting people to feel sorry for me. And maybe there was a time where I needed that. I needed someone to say what happened to you was wrong. I'm sorry to hear that. Maybe there was a time for that. But I was overusing that. And this guy offered me something so helpful. You know, I told him my story once and I was expecting the same old, oh, poor you, you know, let me put my arm around you. And he said, oh, I'm really sorry to hear all that, but what are you going to do about it? And I
mm,
remember at the time thinking, like, what the F? Like, how dare you say this to me? Haven't you heard my story? But the more I thought about it, I was like, you know what? He's right. Like, he's challenging me to grow. And this
mm,
kind of speaks to, you know, the core thing, which I think men need and we've lost is initiation, which comes back to this thing of like, you need to face your hardship of life. You need to bear your cross. You need to die and be reborn. You need to realize life isn't about you. You need to realize there is something much bigger than you going on in life and give
mhm,
yourself to that process. And ultimately, that's what he offered for me. He showed me there was a way I could actually learn to grow as a man. And then through time, I really started to find myself. I found myself deeply spiritually connected, and found, if you like, in my understanding, you know, my true parentage, my true father was God. And with that came a deep, deep sense of peace,
mhm,
and ultimately allowed me to connect with my earthly father again and understand
mm,
his limitations. He's also a child, effectively, in the eyes of
mhm,
God. So he's
mhm,
lost too. And I could deeply understand that. So my resentment went. My resentment for my elder brother went as well, even though he'd passed on by that point. But I was able to really start to pray for his soul, you know, and
Mm,
pray for forgiveness for him and for myself. And then live, if you like, this path of discipline, of tradition, which guided me through and showed me a way of living. And with that, if you like, came the ability to finally have healthy interactions with women as well, you know. And I did that for a while, had a few relationships, and then um, effectively that took me to the foot of what I do now, which is Awakened Man, where I originally was called Recovering Man. I built a website which was about nutrition and spiritual health, personal development. But then it whittled down into essentially Awakened Man, which is taking guys on these transformative processes of
mm,
that lost boy state, as I call it, into finding themselves as men. It's not the end of our path, but it is that journey, which is so,
mm,
so important. Sometimes called the age 30 transition. Most of the guys I work with are anywhere between, well, the average is between like 27 and 37. But I have worked with guys as young as 21 or even as old as 51. Because ultimately, so many men have lacked that journey, if like from
mm,
letting go of some of those boyhood pains, those resentments that keep them trapped, and
mm,
opening up to something much more profound. But ultimately, it's like a death of what we are and a
mm,
rebirth of something new. Ultimately rooted in love. I might have to emphasize what I mean by that word, because again, I think we have a very feminine understanding of the word love. Basically,
mm,
when we think about it in modern culture, it's like pop music, which is more obsession with
mhm,
sex, or it might be just a feminine, soft compassion. Now, that's
mm,
part of it. That's part of it, but there's a masculine side to it as well, which is very, very important to me. It really changed my life having that.
mm,
And again, when you have that wholeness, you can really start to move forward.
mm.
So henceforth, that became my path. And there's about another 7 years, but that's much more of the positive story of how I got from building Awakened Man to getting engaged and all the rest of it.
Wow.
So yeah.
I'd like to hear that as well. I think thank you for sharing so intimately because I didn't know all of that, and thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. Um, yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks for sharing so openly. I think you answered. I'm just looking at my questions. I think you answered questions 1 and 2 at least, and probably all of them better than I could have asked for. But just thinking of reflecting on myself. I mean, I think we're similar. I'm 38. How old are you?
36.
If you don't mind. Okay, so similar generation. I'm even older. Gosh, I feel really old now. But I mean, gosh, I had my own couple of things that stood out when you spoke. I had a bit of a like a breakdown, which was much later, maybe after a relationship broke down, or like 2 relationships broke down. Um, and I was exploring meditation, exploring spirituality. I've looked at some things that I wrote before all that, and I was really hurtling towards like looking for some kind of breakthrough. And as probably it's a well told story, often the breakthrough doesn't come in the way that you like hoped, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's not all sweet doves and stuff. And it was like the darkest time of my life.
Exactly.
Then I kind of now after that really much more confidently would identify as a Christian. I
Mm,
thought that tried Buddhism, I've read about Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, existentialism, whatever, philosophy, stoicism, and I was like, I get it. Like, I need to choose. I want to choose something, and and but I was brought up kind of Christian, I guess, anyway, and it was a safe place, but it was also something that felt real. I decided I believed in Jesus, I believed in God, that the Bible was powerful, and I decided I believed all that. My point being, I'm in a new relationship, great, but more recently, in the last year, I've been like, oh gosh. Actually, immediately after the breakdown, it was like I felt more powerful, more energized, more disciplined. I've got all that, but now I'm having problems again. I hoped all my problems were solved, and I'd just reached a new level of clarity and really self-discipline. Um, and unfortunately, and I thought prayer would solve everything, and I still do go back to prayer. I still have my routine in the morning, definitely, but just more recently, in the last kind of 6 months, I've kind of been disappointed to find that I haven't reached like nirvana. Do you know what I mean? And I'm
mm,
still got lust, and still got things that I hoped had kind of died in me. Do you know what I mean?
mm, mm, mm.
Um, so then you were talking about that transition and becoming a man, and not being in that boy state. And I'm like, gosh, I've still got that boy in me that I thought had been burned by the fire of of life, you know. So does that make sense? Maybe that's something you've heard of from other people, but I hope.
Yeah. No, I hear what you're saying, 100%. And also, I mean, I've felt similar things myself, and it really helped me. I think I read a line in, I think it was Thomas the Kempis, who's a very old school Christian mystic type, and he said, "We very rarely burn brighter than the moment of our transformation."
Mm,
And it's really interesting insight. And I thought, yeah, that's some truth to that. Like, even
mm,
though I know more now and I can articulate it a lot more clearly now, I was
mm,
never booming like I was in that first probably 6 months to 2 years immediately
mm,
after. And I'm like 8 years after. So it's
mm,
like it was actually 7 years after. So I think there's really something in that. Now,
mm,
again, I think it's different people have different experiences. There are the Eckhart Tolle types who they just drop out and it's all rainbows and fairies. But I think that's very rare in my experience.
mm,
I've spoken with lots of people and lots of different spiritual teachers from different traditions, and it's quite rare that you find someone completely like that. But hearing what you say there, I do identify with it to some extent, but I also think there's a beauty to it, man. I mean, that's the part of our journey, especially on the Christian path, where it is, if you like, it's that battle with the flesh and the truth of God within. And
mm,
again, I personally have gained a great deal from reading St. Paul, which always surprised me because, again, a bit like I came from a Buddhist background originally. Before even that, it was very secular, atheist, all that sort of stuff. I'll
mm,
never go near the church. The church is all flying spaghetti monsters, it's all load of nonsense. And that was kind of my background, especially with the philosophy. And then, I
mm.
mean, even Nietzsche, famously said God is dead. And
Yeah, that's
again,
what put me off him.
yeah, exactly. And I think he even himself understood how damaging that was for him and for society. But I
Mm,
still don't think we truly grasp how well fatal that really was for Western culture, but even arguably world culture. In terms of, it was the shift away from this divine sense of life towards it's the man's mind which defines reality, and that only. Now
mm,
that's a podcast that could last 24 hours in and of itself, but ultimately, I think that has trapped so many people in the body mind. And ultimately, I think for me, there's a beauty in the Christian journey. There's a beauty to our wounds. It's not about being perhaps perfect, but acknowledging we're imperfect. And that's where
mm,
these great sayings through the sages down the years come from. Like, yeah, I think it's Rumi who said, through the wound, the light shines. I think that's what he
mm,
means, that we have to look at these areas of our life where we're like, actually, I'm not as good as I think I am,
mm,
and maybe I do still struggle in these certain areas. And we realize that is part of being a man. And the amount of
mm,
guys that I've worked with who come with that underlying assumption, it's very male, if you like. We have that sense of like, yeah, I want to be perfect. I want to try and really be as good as I can possibly be and
mm,
exhibit, if you like, this raw masculine energy or raw spiritual energy. But
mm,
beneath that, I think we have to say, like, look, imperfection is part of life, man. It's in the
mm,
external sense, we can find perfection in God internally, but in the external manifest world, it's a world of birth and death and mistakes and
mm,
challenges and pain
mm,
and confusion and getting things wrong. But ultimately, I think that's what faith is. It's being able, like, not to say that the divine can't manifest itself in the external and smooth our lives out in certain ways, but that happens via that internal change. So
mhm.
again, I do deeply identify with what you're saying, but I think this is a battle for men, all men in our modern world, to, especially with the temptations that are around in this day and age, to work on that, moving away from that easy, effeminate, if you like, as sometimes called, boyish behavior, towards something which is more disciplined, which is rooted in love, which is ultimately doing the right thing
Mhm,
over easy pleasure. And I think that is
mhm.
all part of the battle, but we're not expected to be perfect. We're just expected to give our hearts to that well, that divine
Right.
light which guides us on the path.
Mm. No, yeah. I mean, yeah. Yeah. That's really, yeah. I think I agree. I was just thinking, as you said, about just that time after, immediately after, or during, or after a breakdown. And I was thinking, I remember, like, I would like cry more easily, which was very, very therapeutic, but like music, like everything like sounded like I was really into music again, like when I was like 15 or something. Do you know what I mean? Like everything was like, I don't know, just listening to music. I remember I was really passionate about music again. Things just sounded like I was hearing it for the first time again, and things like that. And not that I'm not like nostalgic about it. It's good to know that's still kind of there, and you still have access to that. But I was just raw, I guess, raw and extra sensitive to things, and but even the just the natural world and things like that. I do think I've got a new appreciation for life, to be honest. Like when you lose someone, I was listening to Nick Cave yesterday talk about when
Nice.
he lost his not the music, but he was
Oh, not
talking.
the music. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, no, he lost a son. He had twin sons, and he lost one of them. And he was talking about he thought he was like he just said I wasn't a complete human being until I went through that. And I know he just obviously changed him profoundly, but he appreciated some of the changes. Things he just felt himself to be more sensitive, more rounded, more accepting that he actually doesn't know anything, and just less arrogant, I guess he was saying, and less self-righteous and things like that. And it was just interesting to hear him say that. But I'm interested. Your work is men's work. You've mentioned a lot about the journey that men need to go through. And I know, like from following you on social, like that's your work. And you're talking to men all the time. Your content seems to be directed at men. So I'll skip. I mean, you gave such a rich answer that I'll skip ahead and just try and get into this, which was my what I guess one. Can you describe like what your work is, what the work of Awakened Man is? What does it look like now? Like what do you do with people that you work with, and what can you share about that?
Yeah. I mean, I do work with men. I think it's important to maybe stress it's certain types of men I work with, because I mean, when I go back to Leicester and speak to my friends there about it, like, they just don't get it at all, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine. But then I'll speak to someone, who'll give me a call, and they totally get it. Like, they totally get it. So I think it's very often I'd say the sort of men that will be looking for that the transformation that I offer is men who are usually quite aware. They're usually quite bright. They're usually been searching through life. They're seeking in some way, and they want that wholeness. They want that sense of integration. They want something outside of the norm, so to speak. It's very often tends to be those people. Like, most of the guys I chat with when we have an intro call, they've always got something interesting to say, whatever the challenges they're facing. They get a lot of things, and I think that that's very important to stress, because there are some guys out there who are literally like football and beer, and that tends to be enough for them. But there's always a guy in that group, and it's just not.
Yeah,
It's just not. And
there
they
is always
need,
a guy in the group. You're right. Yeah.
And I find that a lot of guys that say, I just can't speak to my friends, and they don't get it, and they need that extra added bit of depth about growing and finding themselves in a new way. And of course, like I say, there aren't many paths anymore for men to go on a journey of self-realization outside of the norm. It's a big journey that men need to go on to find themselves, and they need to be dipped into challenge and new ways of being, so to speak. And ultimately, of course, again, that has all manner of different capacities. I often think that the core of the work that I do, if you like, is trying to mirror initiation in a sense. I think that's very, very hard to do in the modern world, because initiation originally is dangerous, and it's very, very challenging. It's even existential in a way. It will almost put you at a life or death place, which was kind of similar to what happened to me. But you can't obviously do that in the modern world. So you have to kind of, I believe, try and recreate something which is at least adjacent to that, because there's this big debate in the arena, like, well, you can't really do it anymore. But my answer to that is like, well, what do you do? Just give up? Say, sorry, guys, like, all you got to do is stay like an eternal 22-year-old. It's like, no, we need to try and help men. We need to try and do what we can. Trying to allow them to connect on a very deep level with other guys, and challenge themselves in new ways, and awaken that inner king, warrior, magician, lover, etc., etc. So ultimately, I see it somewhat aligned with that, and it's the great move, if you like, from the world to the spirit. In the context of our conversation, you might say that that's something like from Nietzsche to Eckhart Tolle, if you like, in modern pop culture language. It's also from the feminine to the masculine. I'm very big on that. Obviously, as I said, in my early upbringing, it was no real men, so I didn't understand what masculinity was. And I think there's a massive problem with that. So many men I speak to, they might have had a father around, but his father might have just gone out and earned money and not really emotionally engaged with his son. I find that a lot. He may
Mm.
have just been distant with his son. He may have been the tyrant, so he's too forceful, or he may just not have been there. And henceforth, men grow up without that guidance into an established manhood. And I think that's
Mm.
very, very difficult for men. And they have to understand that's not navigating what it all means. Because the sharks in the water, as I would call it, there's the excesses of what you might call hyper masculinity, which is like playing the tough guy. Of course, that might look good for a while. It might make you feel great, but eventually it always collapses. You can't do
Mm.
that forever. On the flip side, you act hyper weak, and apologetic for your own existence. Well, you don't want that either. And then outside of that, you've got some of the excesses of feminism, which pushes it too hard, which almost denigrates everything about masculinity. Now, I'm not saying that's every single feminist. I understand there are feminists who get where I'm coming from, and I've spoken to them. But on the more radical side, which tends to be more radical in the pop culture, sorry, more popular in the popular culture, it does have a bit of a competition side to it. And there's a denigration or the kind of like drinking male tears type stuff. And you think, well,
Mm.
it's very easy to get lost in those things. I got lost in them, in differing ways. It was kind of a bit of a hodgepodge of all of them. I got quite radical in my political views and very angry with the world. But at the same time, I was very soft, hated confrontation. But on the flip side, I'd also listen to gangster rap. So it's like a
Mm.
weird mix of all
Yeah.
these things going on. And then when I started to work it out, I was like, yeah, what I'm looking for there, I'm angry. So I want to bring down, if you like, my own pain towards men that have hurt me. At the same time, I'm afraid of life because I've never been initiated and actualized. And
Mm.
also, I go into the gangster rap because it's one of the few forms where aggression is allowed in our culture. And I can almost embody that and feel kind of cool. Not that I ever made out myself to be a rapper or anything, but it felt like an art form where you're like, oh, this is exciting. It's testosterone, it's driven. But of
Mm.
course, I'd see that. Look, again, not all rap music. I'm fully aware that there is a lot of deep and incredible rap music. But
Mhm.
again, the mainstream, what's often pushed towards you
Mhm.
is a bit more on that side of it, just pure aggression,
Mhm.
very egocentric. And ultimately, again, it wasn't going to help me actualize a deeper integrated sense of masculinity. So essentially, what we're doing is going on what I call the 7-step path. I won't go into too much detail about it because I can ramble on forever about it. If guys are interested, there is a free ebook about it on my website, awakenmind.co.uk. But the ultimate idea is we have a real, first of all, a deep inventory of our soul. What has damaged us? What has really impacted us? Where are our traumas? Where's our anger? Where's our pain? Who's it against? Why? What are we shameful about? What are we afraid of? What's happened in our sexual lives that we might be ashamed of or frightened of? That's a big question out there that guys
Mm.
never get to talk about. I'm not saying that every guy's got like mad sexual stuff, but simple things that guys never get to talk about, like, have they ever been with a woman and felt like, I don't actually really like this person, but I feel like I've got to kind of be with her? Have you ever been kind of vengeful over an ex who dumped you and just slept with 20 girls to try and get back at her, but then
Mm.
abused them? That's all bad karma for you, man. We have to start making sense of all of that and understand who and what you are as a man.
Mm.
So we go quite deep into every area of their life and any guilt, any skeletons, etc., etc. And then we go through rituals. I'm very big on rituals. I often say to guys on calls, if I was to pour a glass of water over my head, they would remember that maybe in 5 to 10 years. Because that weird guy who poured water on his head. But that's the power of ritual. It's the symbolic marker, which shows us a new direction, if you will. So I know I'm not saying I pour water over my head, but we do all kinds of rituals, and I get the guys to all sorts of things, which act as markers, if you like, the death of an old consciousness and the birth, if you like, of the true consciousness, which is one and unbroken and within.
Mm.
And then we sort of pull that out into a world of their code of honor as a man, their tradition, their mission, their transcendence, and the goals that they're going to chase down before moving into the classic feminine and masculine areas. As I say, might have been over feminized, might have been under feminized, might have been over masculinized, but most guys have been under masculinized, probably 90%. And then we have a final big ritual at the end. It's a very quick overview. There's a lot more to it than that.
No,
I
it
just
sounds
don't want to go overboard.
no. And how do you do? Does this happen like face to face at the moment, or like you speak a bit of both, or like you
Bit of
doing
both,
calls?
yeah, a bit of both. It really depends where people are because I work internationally now. I mean, that really
Wow,
started in lockdown. It was face to face. I work predominantly in London, but then
wow.
lockdown happened, which for people like me was a bit of an advantage because ultimately I was then just offering my service. Well, to be honest, it started with men's groups, which I still run a bit, But I started a men's group, and then it just fed into the work. So,
Mm.
you know, I'm working with guys from America to India to South America, like wherever really.
Wow.
Mainly, I'd say in Europe and America, but all around the world. If they're in England, then yeah, I do one-on-one work face to face. Second to that, England's a lot easier to do groups, so I'll
Mm.
do actual men's groups, but also run online men's groups as well for other guys.
How long did it take you to? How long were you working on this 7 steps? This process, this journey, this program of learning and growth. Like, how long did that take for you to construct?
Yeah,
It
that's
sounds
a
like a
great question.
culmination of all of your own work, of course.
Yeah, that's a great question, man. So again, I would probably say that it was an amalgamation of loads of different things that I got myself involved in. So from recovery work to 12-step stuff to spiritual work to men's work, there's all sorts of things I did.
Mm.
And originally I didn't intend to do one-on-one work, but what I wanted to have was this platform for men where it would be about everything. I'd interview different people and get papers in about all sorts of different things, from spirituality to physicality to working out to diet, etc., etc.
Papers, get papers in. You said.
Yeah, yeah. Again, I say
Mm.
that because yeah, I mean, I'd come from a publishing background, so
Yeah.
that was the model I was going to basically recreate, was what I'd worked on with different companies, where ultimately I provide a platform where you can get the best information. You know,
Mm.
when I say papers, it might be academic papers, which I would read
Makes
through and
sense.
break them down. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. But again, it was too big when I look back. It was way too big of a plan, and it was too ambitious, if you like, because, you know, as I'm sure we're all aware, when you go online, you can get just awesome advice. Like we're saying at the beginning about sleep. I mean, if you want to learn about sleep, you don't really want to listen to me, who's a jack of all trades. You want to go listen to Dr. Matthew Walker, who's an
Mm.
absolute neuroscience expert in sleep. Like, why
Mm.
would you? And I might feature something on him, but it was too much for me to want to do as an individual to try and put
Mhm.
all that together. So I really just thought, like, well, what is all this about? And I narrowed it down, and basically it became about transformation and initiation. And I wrote a book originally about the process I'd been on, and then people started saying, look, do you do one-on-one work? To which I was like, oh, I guess I could. So then I started doing a bit of life coaching training, etc., etc. And in that time, I built what's now the 7-step path. It was originally 9, but I took it down to 7.
Mm.
And then really that was a process of thinking. There was a little bit of traditional life coaching in there, but I don't see myself as a life coach. I see myself as more on the spiritual men's coach. But there
Mm.
was a little bit of that in there, but it was mainly rooted in what you might call men's work, spiritual work, and recovery work. That's what it really was. And I tried to find what are the common themes between these. You know,
Mhm.
what is the real salt that's in there, which gives it its quality?
Mhm.
And then on top of that, what are men really lacking? You know, and again, if I put up a post which says something about men lacking guidance, there'll be 4 or 5 guys every time which reach out to me and say, "Oh, I really identify with that." You know, it's
Mm.
such a common thing with men
Mm.
today. They
Mm.
lack that sense of guidance. So obviously, they're not coming to me to be the authority and the guidance. We have to find where they can get that guidance. I can help to an extent. I'll
Mm.
be their helper. You may have heard of the hero's journey. It's a famous
Yeah.
Joseph Campbell symbol. Yeah, and
Yeah, yeah. I was going to say
yeah.
you're Obi-Wan Kenobi, but that wasn't quite
No,
when
no, no,
I
it's
thought of
really
it.
good. It's really good. I'd agree with that. I think Obi-Wan
Mm.
Kenobi is a really good example. Yeah, yeah, I think that's
Mm.
kind of perfect. And I try and play that role as the helper. I'm not going to be there
Mm.
forever, but I'm that helper
Mm.
which is going to take them from the known to the unknown to the death and rebirth and back
Mm.
through. And then
Mm.
after that, well, it's their life then. And of course, towards the
Mm.
end of the work, we do work on that quite a lot about, well, how are we going to build those structures which give you, again, that deep sense of tradition, mission, and transcendence. You know, the
Mm.
3 cores that hold a man together. And we
Mm.
need each of those. And we also need men that we can look up to and be
Mm.
guided by. And that, again, is hard to find. I'm not trying to make out, because it used to drive me mad. You know, I go to all these business retreats and people would say, oh, what you need is a mentor. And say, well, we all know that, but where do you find a mentor? That's the
Mm.
question.
Mm.
So
Mm.
what I try and do a lot with guys is think about mentors in different areas. So you try and make a whole mentor via the many, you know,
Wonderful.
unless we're extremely lucky. We just have one guy who we can really look up to, but that's rare. That's really
Mm.
rare, you know. And
Mm.
ultimately, I think that's what we should aim to be as men. If we become fathers as well, is that well-rounded mentor to our children, but of course, without being tyrannical about it. If they need to go elsewhere, you have to let them go.
Mm. Well, that was like, for the first time, after listening to the whole journey from where you started and your own personal journey to there, like, I feel like I get it, like, about 80% more.
Mm.
like they're your because of your past and your own journey. I guess like what I heard is that you're acting as a guide for people, men that kind of need what you've been through it. You can like lead the way to a degree. So it's not for like every man, but like for guys that have been a similar situation or lacking the things that you were lacking or
Exactly.
struggling with the things that you were struggling with.
Exactly. Yeah.
Much like someone in the sport, the sporting read. I injured my shoulder recently, and like I'm doing a personal training program. And sadly, one of the guys, a mentor of mine, a really, really, really experienced personal trainer, he was doing Olympic weightlifting and jiu-jitsu, and a really bad injury ended his career.
Mm.
But unfortunately, and I'm going to draw a bit of an analogy here, it was in injuring himself, and I've experienced the same thing, that I've learned, I've become an expert on this particular joint now, just through the fact that I injured it, there was dysfunction there, and in trying to see what had gone wrong, I know a lot more about that part of my body than I did. And this guy who I'm talking about, he just became an expert in musculature and physiology, posture and everything, which wouldn't have happened if he didn't have that, didn't have that injury. If he didn't have that injury, he would have just been cracking on doing what he was doing. A long way of saying, I guess I understand a bit better now why you do the kind of work you do, and the sorts of men that might seek you out, and why you'd be well placed to deliver that work.
Mm.
Question. I was going to say, like, what I wanted to say when you're talking is like, do you know of like some men either in your real life, or are there men that you do think are well adjusted and complete and whole? Like, are there men like that, or do you think it's a minority of men that are like over feminized? Or I know,
I think there are definitely men who are well rounded. I mean, again, to go back to the thing we mentioned earlier about the Christian mission, I think no man is ever going to be perfect. We're always going to be limited in our own way. But one of the things I will get guys to do when we do the work is to ask them exactly that question. I think, well, who do you think is out there? As I mentioned earlier, I'm very fond of the king, warrior, magician, lover archetypes for men. I think that's very, very important. I think that the magician and the lover are very often overemphasized in men today. But not the warrior and not necessarily the king. The king is there, but he needs some awakening. The warrior is not there for lots of men. But then you get the flip side. I'd say about 80% of the men that I come across are kind of a bit like me. They're kind of lover magician types.
Yeah.
But they haven't got a warrior, and they need to find the warrior. Now, there will be guys out there that have got the warrior, but the problem with guys who are natural warriors, they don't usually have anything else, And I personally believe that we're all on that mission of balancing those energies out, and you can meet guys I think have done really well. I mean, I often say to guys, a guy like Joe Rogan, for instance, I think he's a good example of a well-rounded man. He's not perfect. He's got his flaws. He's got his faults. He tends to own his flaws and faults, which I think, again, is credit to him for that. But I don't think it's a coincidence he's so successful and so popular, because he speaks to every one of those energies. He's a warrior with his MMA stuff. He's a king with his podcast. He sort of lives how he likes. He does his own thing. He's sovereign in what he wants to do.
So true.
Exactly. He's a magician with his stand-up and all that sort of stuff, and arguably his MMA too. And he's a lover. Like, you can see him on his podcast. For someone who's quite physically capable, he'll also have stand-up comedians on who are like, kind of weedy, nerdy guys from New York. And he'll be like, oh, hey, man, how's it going? Be really friendly. You're like, okay, that's really cool. And I think we all like that. When you meet someone who is physically tough, but they're also really kind and they're friendly. I think we all like that as men. We think, oh, this guy's cool. If they're just kind, well, we like them, but you think it's kind of a bit, they're lacking something. If they're just a tough guy, you feel like, well, good for you and all that for being hard, but you don't really want to kind of be with them. But when we're more well-rounded, I think that's something we should all be trying to build towards. And it's not to say Joe Rogan's perfect. I mean, again, I personally don't agree with everything he says, but then how could you? We're all individuals, and we're never going to agree with absolutely everything. I'm also a very big fan of Jocko Willink, actually. I think he's great. I think he's really awesome. I like the way he's so dedicated as a warrior. He's a classic warrior.
What's the book?
Discipline Equals Freedom.
No, it's like
Extreme
Ultimate Responsibility or something. His first book. His catchphrase is like, relentless accountability or something like that, 2 words together. But yeah, he's great. He
Oh,
seems great as
extreme
well. But
ownership is about
I
it.
guess with Jocko Willink, like, and I've listened to the whole book, but like where he's like, is he a Marine or a Navy SEAL
Let's
or
see. Oh, yeah.
whatever? And I guess and it makes sense that like a book from someone that's been through all of that has value and is like going to be extremely popular. I guess what I'm getting at, and he does look like a monster, you know, like he's just huge. But I guess what I'm getting at is one, I guess there isn't much much call and many spaces where we need a warrior. There's not a huge amount of physical challenge or luck, you know, luckily or whatever. So I can see why that part of men has kind of like diminished or not been nurtured and nourished because they're just unfortunately or unfortunately there just isn't, life doesn't ask that of us at the moment. Like, you know, I know many men, and we just live, you know, we live in the developed world. There's not many areas where a warrior is needed. Hence, everyone's getting it. I'm into boxing, and everyone's getting into MMA and that. And I can see again intuitively why everyone wants to try that, because men get to like 25 and we've never had a fist fight, and we're like, oh wow, this is something that I like, and this is something, it speaks to a part of me that I didn't even know was there, and I feel good after it. It builds confidence. I get that, and literally you have to go to an MMA gym to find that, like to get into a physical altercation. If you want to feel that, the only place that you can do is go to MMA gym, and it's hugely popular, and I get that. Where was I going? My point is there anyone? Jocko Willink seems to me to be quite an extreme example. Do you see just everyday guys that are yeah, everyday guys that you think are well-rounded and whole? Joe Rogan and Jocko Willink aside, more kind of, yeah, just more like in your everyday life. Do you meet
Yeah, I
many?
mean, I think that you do come across certain people like that in your day-to-day life. I do think it happens.
Mm,
Again, I think such people probably wouldn't be drawn to my material that much because they're just
mm,
not thinking about these sorts of things.
mm,
But yeah, I definitely think I've met them. I think they're a rarity. I think
mm,
most of us have to do a lot of work on it. I think
mm,
personally, if you have a very good father figure
mm.
growing up, I think that you've got a shortcut to that. Again, I would agree that you don't need to be total Jocko Willink. I was just sort of raising him because I think he's a warrior without being too excessive. And I think that's the kind of flip side of, I think, what we need to
Yeah.
search for as well. But it's like, again, I'm sure you can, well, I know I've found people like that out there, but I think ultimately it does depend on having quite a good upbringing and good values and good tradition around you to master. And even then you won't be perfect. But of
Mm.
course, I just want to add as well, like, I understand what you're saying about the warrior isn't required in so much in this day and age, but I still think men need to find the warrior in their
I
own way.
agree.
Because, yeah, they
I
just
agree.
there'll be a part of their soul missing if
I
they
agree.
don't express it in some way. And
I
also,
agree.
of course, the other thing is warrior doesn't just have to be the physical. You know, you can have a mental warrior.
Mm.
Again, I think there's a great Bob Marley which I always like, which is emancipate yourself from mental slavery. Because there's a warrior element to that. It's a lovely mix, if you like, of the magician and the warrior together. So
Mm.
it's different ways in which the warrior can manifest himself. And a big thing that I come across with guys today, I think we all, you know, have a bit of a struggle with getting this right, is assertiveness. You know,
Mm.
every man wants to be assertive, but it's very easy when you try and be assertive to go either too aggressive or be too anxious. So it's like getting that just right is very challenging.
I'm
And I
not
think
good
it
at that.
yeah, man, I think it requires almost, I think, letting out the warrior and letting the warrior almost go a bit too far sometimes, which I know is a bit dangerous, but you have to allow yourself to make mistakes, you know.
Mm.
When I say go too far, I don't mean going out and beating someone up. That's not what I'm saying. But maybe you'll think like, okay, how did I get that time? Was I a bit maybe I was a little bit overboard. That's why, of course, mentors are very helpful to just guide us on that path. But we almost need sometimes to go a little bit over the boundary to understand where the boundary is
Mm.
in both senses. You know, sometimes we might be too soft, other times we might be too hard. But it's in those experiences we really learn. You know.
Well, have you got time to tell me about your fun? This is something I'll literally go back and listen to this, and I've got great value just from listening, and I think anyone listening in can, or any guy listening in can reflect on these things. Have you
Mm.
got time to tell me about your fast that you did recently?
Yeah, sure, man. Yeah, yeah.
Um, because we just got started talking again about the fact that in the Bible Jesus talks about fasting. There's one particular passage I seem to remember, and the disciples were unable to. The disciples were unable to purge someone of being possessed by an evil spirit. Or that's what it says. And Jesus says, "Oh, these can only be removed by prayer and fasting." And I know, like intermittent fasting and fasting generally, like people at the moment talking about the benefits of it, different diets. But I was interested in you and reached out to you because you were talking about the spiritual aspect of it, which not many people do talk about. And it seems it gets mentioned a lot in the Bible, but I never hear anyone at a Christian church, modern Christian church, talking about fasting. So can you just tell me about your experience and what you think? Yeah, what you think about what you thought about the process and how was it for you?
Yeah, no, awesome question, man. Very well laid out as well. I think that I would agree. The Christian tradition, no, well, to be honest, the Christian tradition is fine, but the way we interpret it today is too soft. You know, I
Mm.
think fasting needs to be a challenge. I think it needs to be hard. I mean, I've heard things around Lent where people are like, limit yourself to 2 meals a day. That's not fasting, man. Like,
Or give
we
up
need to.
chocolate. That's
Yeah,
what most people like. Give
exactly.
up chocolate, give up cheese, pick
Yeah.
something and give it up. That's
Yeah. It's too soft and nothing is going to happen when you do that. This is just easy. We need to push ourselves a bit more.
Mm,
But ultimately, again, in my experience with fasting, it's always deeply insightful. I always feel much closer to God when I fast. I think it also is massively good at bringing down lusts and desires and attachments to the world. I think when you pull away, if you like, from eating, which is one of the most fundamental needs we have, especially in the modern
mm,
world where we're so spoilt with food. I mean, many people, when I say that, get a bit angry. I know people struggle out there, but we still don't understand in a historical context how lucky we are with regards to
mm.
how much food we have around us,
I'm still
even though
meditating with food. I've been trying to get some
well,
work done, and I bought I and I went. I had sat down for 2 hours on the computer, and I had to go and get a coffee and a cookie, and that's one of my biggest. Well, that's definitely I'm medicating with food all the time. There's
yeah,
something.
man. And again, so many people are, and I think as well, you think about what a lot of the great spiritual masters and teachers did throughout the years. I mean, they went without food for a long time, and that was quite normal. And of course, you mentioned, people do intermittent fasting for that reason. It's in our evolutionary DNA and all that sort of stuff. But fasting for me, it's not about like looking physically good. I mean, that's good and all that. That's a nice bonus, but it's ultimately about your spirit. It's about recoiling from the world to a certain extent and coming to a much more simplistic state of being. I've never been able to fast effectively if I don't read beforehand, read some helpful spiritual material to
Mm,
remind me of what this process is. If anyone is interested in doing a bit more, Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline is excellent. It's 12 disciplines in the Christian tradition, and fasting is one of them. And he really lays it out beautifully. I often read that before I'll fast.
okay.
And it's very, very effective at letting us know what this is really about. It's
Mm,
about getting closer to God. It's about ultimately removing the most fundamental things we need. So, if you like, a deep appreciation of what we have comes naturally. Secondly, or thirdly, sorry, it allows us to connect with those people out there in the world who do struggle. There are people out in the world right now who can't eat. And feeling their pain allows us to feel that deeper connection with them. And of course, as we should aim to do, if you like, if we're involved in the Christian tradition in some way, we must try and imitate Christ to a certain
mm,
degree. Now, we're never going to be able to do that fully, but we've got to at least try and follow his leadership and guidance. And he always, always taught to care for the needy, to think about the poor, to think about those people who can't help themselves. So again, it allows us to do that as well. But perhaps most importantly, again, like you spoke to, I think it's a fantastic way of dealing with demons. Now, we might use demons in a metaphorical
mm,
or symbolic sense here. A demon could be an addiction. Again, it could be scoffing cookies and coffee. There's all sorts of ways that they can manifest in our life, and they come in so subtly. So
mm,
perhaps the most fundamental for me, and this is what I got from Emmett Fox, who's a very interesting guy, but he was speaking about fasting isn't just about fasting from food, it's also about fasting from thoughts. And I was like, that's really, really insightful. So when we fast, it's not just like, okay, I'm not going to eat and I'm going to think about God more. It's like, no, I'm not going to eat and I'm going to try not to think, you know? And what that means is, obviously, we can't completely stop thinking, but you let the thoughts go by like a cloud in the sky. when you try to let God control your mind, your body, your soul, and your heart, and He can do His work on you. You
Mm.
know, now when do we get a chance to do that? Very, very rarely in the modern world. Most people are
No.
so busy, like I said earlier, with the kids on TikTok and people on YouTube or whatever else, or following the news. Information, information, information. Oh, be angry about this. A certain politician said this, and they want you to be like, oh, I can't believe he said that, and get all angry. We need to fast from all of that and come
Mm.
away from all of that toxicity. And I personally find, like, if I fasted and then I go on Twitter, I'm just like, I just can't even be on Twitter. It's
Yeah,
just too
you
toxic.
it will change your palette for physically and
Exactly.
mentally.
Exactly. I
Mm.
can't bear the language that people use towards each other, like, you effing idiot. And it's just like, relax. Like, this is not
Mhm.
helping anyone. No one's going to be like, oh, do you know what? That's a really good point. Thanks for that. And even if
Mhm.
someone did say that, they'd be like, see, I told you, you piece of shit, and all that sort of stuff. And it just shows you how toxic we get. And again, I'm not trying to say I'm above that. We all have to work on that mission of staying, if you like, spiritually centered, to not fall into that world of anger
Mm.
and pain and confusion and ego and trying to prove each other wrong. So fasting is also about that, and finding, if you like, well, what we described as God's unity within us all, which is beyond the external.
Well, how long did you fast for this time?
48 hours, the most recent one.
You didn't eat anything,
Nothing, no, 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 no.
and um, and you prayed more than usual, or you.
Yeah, I probably prayed about the same, but I meditate a lot more than
Mm.
usual.
Mm.
I meditate a lot more, and the meditation I always find feels a lot better, especially around once you get over 24 hours. The
Mm.
longest I've ever done is about 3.5 days. I don't
Mm.
tend to go too much longer than that because quite like to work out and have a bit of a routine going, and also it's quite challenging with work. But
Mm.
normally, if I do fast, I'll do about 48 hours.
How
And I'll
often are
try
you
and
doing
probably
this?
do one every 2 weeks, about 24 hours as well.
Wow. One every 2 weeks. And how long? How often in the last few years have you been doing a longer fast?
Yeah, I mean, usually it'll be around Lent. Usually at the start of Lent and towards the end of Lent will be
Mm.
will be big fasts, and
Mm.
then it might be just somewhere like later in the year. Like again, not too long back, I did a relatively big one. I did 48 hours because I had quite a
Mm.
lot going on in the week after, but I may have gone a bit longer. The other
Wow.
thing is, it's a bit one of these things where I think we have to. You have to almost build up to it a little bit. You have to
Mm.
get your fasting endurance going. I think if you just jump into doing 3 days straight away, you'll really, really struggle.
Mm.
But if you start off with, like, again, if I'm doing regular 24 hours, then I'll push it to 2 days. And then I might go to a three after that, maybe a month or two apart.
This is a challenge I had when talking to my sister about ayahuasca. When you get to talking about the thing, it's like really you have to try it for yourself to get the benefits, to understand where you're trying to get to. I just touch on it and kind of explore the subject, but I think it's one of those things, just like push-ups. You're not going to get the benefits without just doing some. So
Yeah.
that's interesting to me. No, that's interesting to me. That makes sense. Um, I know you've got to get off. I know you've got to get off. So that was great. I was trying to think if I had anything. Any final thoughts? I probably had a question that I didn't write down. I'm just practicing here and getting better at making notes as we go away, as we go along. But how many people are you working with at the moment, roughly, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, no, we're about 5 guys at the moment. I tend to cap off at 8 at a time,
Mm.
just simply because it's a bit too much if there's more than that at once. Because with the work I do, it's not just the actual transformation work. I also like to have quite a close relationship with them, so we're talking a lot
Mm.
on WhatsApp as well throughout the day.
Mm.
Because again, like I often say to them, if they've got an argument with their girlfriend, or they've got some question with regards to the work, I'd rather us cover that in real time, but also build that sense of brotherhood is very important.
I could never. I
So
couldn't do that.
again, yeah, I think.
That'd be a lot. I couldn't do. I can just about deal with my own stuff. I couldn't. I feel like I haven't got the capacity to do that. But we can always talk again. The question that I had was, you moved away, didn't you? You moved back out of London.
Yeah.
What, if you don't mind, what kind of area of the country you're in now?
I'm in Northamptonshire.
Somewhere a bit more. It looks more green, more rural.
Oh, totally rural, man. I'm in the middle of
Yeah.
nowhere. Yeah, yeah.
And what have been the benefits of that? What was the motivation? Has it been what you hoped?
Well, a bit like we mentioned earlier around stresses of London. I mean, I've always been a bit of a highly sensitive person with regards to my surroundings, and I like space and I like peace. And I was in London for a long time, for about 11 years or so, and I like London. Don't get me wrong, but it was just the relentless busyness, the noise, the sharp edges, the lights, and I met my partner in London, but we then started to think about moving out. And why? Well, I wanted to live a more simple, spiritual life close to nature. I
Mm,
also wanted to be able to build my business somewhere where ultimately I can hold events. It's not
mm,
really event season right now, but more in the summer. And what was the transition like? It was quite rocky after being over a decade in London, because you're
mm,
very, very used to, like, Sainsbury's is open till 12 at night, and coffee shops everywhere. And you got, even though in London I find it was very atomized, you do have like a network of 30, 40, 50 people all about half an hour from you. But when you move out, it was a bit odd. It was a bit odd. It was like getting used to a new way of living, and it's like pitch black dark out here in the middle of nowhere as well. So that can be quite odd. But it took me about a month to acclimatize, and once I did, I was very happy with it, really. And of course, I did this with the as a precursor of starting a family,
mm.
and that's what I intend to do out here. So it was a bit of a rocky move, but that lasted about a month, and now I'm very happy. Really, I come back to
Good,
London about once a month as well, so that's good.
good. Sounds good. Oh, a month like sounds like a sensible, reasonable time for an adjustment like that. So
Mhm.
sounds good. Yeah, I mean, I think we'll have to do it. It might be a conversation for another time. I must have gone to quite a left wing university, and I just smoking weed the whole time. So one of the lectures that I could really remember, one of the only sociology lectures that I really remember was this. It was about Marxism, and the lecture, and obviously, well, whether he was speaking the thoughts of himself or Marx, was really about how damaging capitalism is, how unhealthy it is, what Marx predicted. And I guess I'm always inclined, ever since the last 20 years, I guess whatever was said in that lecture kind of rang true. And I'm always inclined, my conversations always end up with, is capitalism the problem? Is just modern life, are we going in the wrong direction because of, I guess, capitalism, industrialization and all that kind of stuff. So that's what I'm nudging towards. But I'm into, just hearing your personal account of moving out of the city into the country just seems like a healthy decision a lot of people make in this time of life anyway. Maybe it's not, maybe we'll have to pick up the capitalism conversation, another chat. I think that's, as you said, that's a whole podcast in itself.
Yeah, that's a big one, man. That's a big one. I mean, I don't know. I used to have a lot of those Marxist ideas at uni. The other things, I'm very wary of big states. I don't really like being told what to do by a big state. That's probably my issue with it. But
Mm,
then the problem is with capitalism, and I do think it has eroded, if you like, spiritual truth. I think it's made us deeply materialistic. It's completely screwed up the rhythms of life. I'm just not sure we've got any alternative that would do anything different. That's probably my biggest problem with it. And of course, the solution, well, I say the solution, but I think that the best thing we can do as men is turn to the spirit, and ultimately know the external world is fallen. Is my view. Now, there's better and worse in the external world, but that peace and justice and truth we're looking for is within. I don't think it's in the external world. And I think one of my issues with Marxism was it tries to make a worldly utopia, which for me was is probably a contradiction of the message of Christ, in my understanding.
I don't remember the old, like, I don't even remember. I know what Mark said was an alternative. I don't remember the lecturer laying out the picture of the alternative, and I don't remember being particularly interested in the alternative. I just remember this person saying, everyone's going to be alienated from their work because we're going to be doing jobs that we've got no interest in, and everybody's going to be like divided from the product of their work because of specialization and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, yeah, that does kind of feel like how it is. But the question was inspired by, I watched this guy and he was interviewing Greta Thunberg. He was an Asian guy, great interviewer. I think he used to be editor of a big national newspaper and now he's on the BBC. But he was saying to Greta Thunberg, well, capitalism has reduced infant mortality rates in somewhere like India, where he was from, or his parents' family was from, and literacy and all, since the 70s in these developing countries, literacy's gone up, infant mortality's gone down, all these improvements in the material life of people, which are undeniable. So he said, how can capitalism be bad? It was obviously like a leading question, a confrontational question. And I guess those things are all true. I just wish we could have got there. Does competition and commercialism, was that the only way we could have reached such rapid progress? I guess that's just how I feel. I don't know if anyone's got the answer.
I guess, man, but of course, this is the thing, we're imperfect human beings, aren't we? And who knows what the future holds? Like, can capitalism last forever? No, it will just end up eating up the world. And then of course, this is the problem I think that I found with it, is it's just the alternative. Like, it's that big state, which also I'm very, very wary of personally. I think that there'll be a huge impact on the individual. My fiance actually is also from Eastern Europe, so there's a big thing about where they actually had communism, and we have like very interesting conversations. Very interesting to listen to her parents and her grandparents and their experiences there. But again, I mean, I do ultimately believe that there will have to come a time where there is something, if we're to survive as a species, which leapfrogs both of the systems we have, because there is a problem. Again, I think Mark's made some valid points. But ultimately, again, it's just the alternative, though. It's so dangerous. I mean, I think, and this is why I ultimately believe, I think the system is secondary to the state of people's hearts and souls.
I agree.
And if we can get that right, then I think there will always be worldly systems will always have problems. They'll never be perfect. But at least if we can get the hearts right, we can then go from there. And of course, you won't be able to get everyone's heart right, but if you can get the majority of people, and again, I think that's why both of us have turned back to some form of Christianity in a way, because we both realized, like, I don't think we can find what I'm looking for in the external. It's got to be something deeper than that, which transcends that.
Yeah. And you can then go out and be that in the world, and everything should. Yeah, I know what you mean. Like the macro solution, you just got to be the solution for yourself and your own life, and you can influence other people, and you can influence other people, and your life will kind of take on a new shape, and ideally everyone's on their own journey kind of thing. So looking at it from a macro
exactly, man, exactly. And also ideally you'd think that this is why, again, I think it's a great loss to the culture, that the sort of Christian values that have eroded and been replaced by ultimately just greed. This is a big problem in London, of course, so much greed. And you think, well, greed is the driver of the market in many ways. But if you're like adhering to deeper values, we would know that greed hurts your brother. So why would you engage in something that we know is sinful? But of course, we don't have anything like that anymore, which acts as that stopgap. And you can say on the flip side, it's the same thing with worldly power, which was a problem in communism and Marxism, where they would, if you like, the bureaucracies and the structure became so big and powerful that some psycho would reach the top of that hierarchy and then just dominate. And you think, well, it's the same principle. The system, again, is secondary to the hearts of the people and the demos, if you like. So that's why I think that it's all about getting that right first. But it's a massive conversation, perhaps for a whole other podcast.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, thanks, Richard. No, you've got another call, so I will just end. What I'll do